Guys, David Vose here. What a beautiful day. It is just another beautiful day. Well, we haven't had any rain for a few days, which, at this point in time, you don't really want that because it's getting colder, and that can even make it colder. But it's beautiful out. The sun is shining, and the cat's running around, taking control of the whole place. My new cat. And old Buster's just standing there staring at that cat. Oh, and he's going, I don't know what. Buster always has done that. He kind of, and whenever he really wants something, or I don't know what his feelings are, he's such a gentle and great guy. He would never hurt the cat or anything, but he's just so curious, and he's just getting used to a cat. He's like, what did you bring this squirrel into the house? Like, what? You brought one of these rabbits in here? I chase rabbits, but he realized, these dogs, they know that they're protectors. Think about their history, or over time, dogs seem to have an affinity to be shepherding dogs. They like to take care of the sheep. They'll live with the sheep and protect the sheep. They protect my chickens, I guarantee it, and these dogs will protect that cat. But it's going to take a few days for them to get used to that cat, that squirrel living with us. But already Barry is the one that took to that cat right away, immediately. And they're laying together and purring and rubbing against each other. And it's great to see. I hope you're having a wonderful day, because it is a wonderful day to be alive. We are closing in on some crazy stuff. And, since we really don't know what's going to happen, we're assuming maybe the Great Tribulation could begin sometime soon. But, Guy, this is just my opinion. Take it for what you will. But I would stash a little bit of your money, if you have any left, in XRP immediately. Within a day or two, that thing could start rising. It could be another month or two. It could be several months. But their plan is to make XRP more or less the bank, the next system. It's going to replace Swift. Very likely, unless they're setting us up for some other kind of, psyop. But and as Christians, when this tribulation begins, we're not going to be able to buy or sell anyway. However, even if you didn't put your money, any of it, in XRP, if you just took it out and had little pieces of paper in your hand, you'd lose the money when it shifts over, because that money ain't going to be worth anything once you take it out of the bank. Maybe if they don't transition through some kind of collapse, they'll let you keep your money and transfer it to the Bitcoin or the XRP or whatever, but we don't know what's going to happen. But all I can say, as Christians, you better have supplies, land. I would seriously recommend everybody having a van or a camper or something to live in. And I would buy land out here near where I am, in the Rocky Mountains, at least. Somewhere here in the Rocky Mountains, in either Arizona or New Mexico. But I would say, or Colorado or something. But, Colorado's getting pretty populated too. But I really would make sure that you've got some land. Anyway, I digress. I want to talk about things we were talking about yesterday. We had described the entire symbolisms behind all this Masonic esoteric wisdom, and we've said that this goes back to Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. And I've done so many videos, and for those of you who have followed most of those videos, you would probably already understand. And I assume by now, if you've watched all my videos, or a lot of them, you'd probably agree and understand what I'm saying. But for those of you who have not ever heard of any of this, that the true Jerusalem was over in Egypt, that King David probably was at Karnak, that, we have never found the Solomon's Temple in this area called Philistia, or Palestine. The Philistines were north of Israel. And the land of Palestine is the land of Philistia. It wasn't a little bitty spot the size of, 30 miles by 10 miles. Up here in Gaza or something. No, it was a much larger area. Meaning the Philistines had 5 kings. Now think about it. A king rules over a territory at least. A territory is probably bigger than 50 by 50 miles. It might be hundreds of miles of territory. And there were 5 actual kings that David defeated to get the Ark of the Covenant. So we find the description of the Temple of Solomon at the Temple of Luxor. Now that Temple of Luxor was made, and we've gone through the dates and stuff, probably about the same time that Solomon was there. But just a little earlier, there was Karnak. Now you can look into Karnak, and Karnak was on a mound, and it was a mound because it was a raised kind of a plateau, and the Nile River went around it. Now, at some point about the time of King David, there is indication that they had been diverting the Nile and making a sacred pool where they did holy baptisms and so forth. And up on this raised island or plateau was a city called Karnak, which was one of the most sacred cities ever, and it was to represent the world being born up out of the mire into a mound. And on top of the mound, they built, Noah's Ark landed there, and so now if you find a city that has this mythology about this original mound, remember it's only going to be a type. They're building a city to describe all of their history. They use the stars and the ley lines of the astrological story, and they will reenact, whether it's up at Sargon of the Akkadians, or if it's King David, or if it's someone else. They're always reenacting this sacred history. So they made a man-made, the island or the mound in between the Nile where it goes around it was a natural island, they say. Very likely could be. But if you look in the Bible, there is a story in, I think, First Chronicles. You hear about someone who diverted or made a dam or did something. The word is they made a flow, or they made a certain flow of water. It's just the word water, mayim, and the word flow. And so, and there's only 2 of these verses that talk about this Gihon, the spring of Gihon. Well, it's not a spring in the Bible. It's only mentioned twice, and it's never spring. Paula was just talking to me about this, and so I thought it fits well with what we're talking about today. The word is a flowing of water, or a great gushing. Now, a spring, you might say a spring is a gush of water, right? So therefore, it's a spring. No, there is another word for a spring. It's mayan. But this me, or the meim, is water itself. It's not a spring. It's just water, the oceans or whatever. Lakes, rivers is water. And then the other word just means to flow or to gush. So they say, well, it must mean a spring. No, if they were going to talk about a spring, they'd use the word mayan, which is a spring. This is a flowing river. And in fact, the Gihon is mentioned one time in Genesis, and it's the river that goes all around the area of Cush. Well, or, they translate it around, but it means down through, from the Mediterranean down through Egypt and down to Cush. Not necessarily around Cush. Cush is the Nubian kingdom south of Egypt. Although it was the land, the Nubian kings, which were Cushites, were from Cush. And sometimes they called it Nubia. Today we call it the Sudan or whatever. And then, of course, the word Ethiopia referred to all of Africa back in those days. It just south, everything. There was no more. That's Ethiopia. And there was on the western side of the west coast of Africa, they were still calling it Ethiopia because there's an Ethiopian sea there. So that's where Ethiopia means, is Africa. But Cush was one of the children of Ham who got this area that became the Nubian kingdom. They were very tall and very black. And yes, for those of you who are wondering, was Egypt, did it have black people? Yes, it had black people, but there were white people there. Remember, every time there's a world power, it is all the people. Babylon had all the people there. They weren't brown like Arabians. They were all the people. They were white, black, brown, Chinese. Everybody was there, whatever color men were in those days. And so Egypt was a world power, and it was like a central location between the land south, north, east, and west. And at that hub, there were all the children of Israel. Israel is 12 tribes, represents the whole circle. And all 12 tribes came from 4 different women, meaning the 4 corners of the fixed signs of the zodiac, which is all the houses, the 12 houses. And so there were women that were white, that gave birth to children. There were women that were black that gave birth to children. Now, the southern kingdom of Israel was the kingdom of Judah. So Judah was the southernmost kingdom. Israel, the 10 northern kingdoms, were north, and that was up around Egypt proper, mostly around Goshen. However, for years, there were 2 kingdoms. There was the southern Egyptian kingdom, which they called the upper because it's higher, and the lower Egypt, because it's lower elevation, is actually north. Anyway, it gets very confusing. But the southern part of Egypt was a lot of the time ruled over by Cush and the Nubians. So that, depending on when you go back and look at the history, they would make the line somewhere else. At one point, the line was probably south of Karnak, the southern kingdom, the Nubians. At another point, the Nubians took control all the way to the Mediterranean. The whole kingdom was unified. And this happened right around the time that David unified the northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. But at this time, around this time, I'm not going to go into specific dates or any proof, but around this time where there was a southern and the northern kingdom, just like we read about Israel and Judah, southern and northern, and the unification and then the dissolution again. After the days of Solomon, they went into apostasy and they split up again. But these were all the peoples of the earth. However, the Nubians for centuries were certainly tall, very dark black people. And they ruled all of Egypt for much of that time, for a lot of the time, for different periods of that time. And at other times, the northern part of Egypt would reign, and they weren't so black. There were some of the Hyksos may have been white that came in, but they all kind of mixed together, and they didn't concern themselves so much about the color of their skin. They weren't a bunch of racists at that time. But of course, if people go off by themselves somewhere over periods of time, they have certain characteristics. But all of us came from Adam, friends. So this primordial story they have in the Egyptian writings, the hieroglyphs, talking about the creation of the world and the patriarchs that they call the Enneads and the Ogdog and these certain individuals and the cosmic powers that made the world. It's all the same story in all the priesthoods. And they believed that the earth was a mound that formed as it came up out of the mire. Probably after the flood, there was a certain place that arrived as a mound, and they called it Ararat in our Bible, where Noah landed the boat. The city of On, which is Noah. Yeah. And this mound then was symbolized in this place called Karnak, this plateau or mountain. And on top of this mountain, there was this city, the city of deity. Now, there's two places in Egypt called Mor. One is Miro, and this is something that we have discovered, which is far south, several hundred miles down the Nile south. And then there is another thing called Mori, or Moerius or something. And they claim it has nothing to do with Meroe. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know. But what I do know is that this place sounds a lot like Mount Moriah or something. King David went to Mount Moriah and built the city of David. Now, David never did build the temple of Jerusalem. Solomon did that in Solomon's temple. That was his son. But about 1000 BC, David built the city of David, which is on Mount Zion, on the mound. Today we just think, oh, he built a little house for himself. Maybe it was a castle. He was a king, right? Oh, it was pretty big, And so all of these places down in Egypt correspond to different places like Bethel and Bethlehem. And as we've said, Bethlehem is the city of Dendera. And the temple there was the temple of Hathor, which in our Bible we call Miriam or Mary. Miriam is the one who had the lineal priesthood. And this is where Samuel, Samson, David, and Jesus and everybody was born in Bethlehem, because that's this place where the priests were. And they ruled at Luxor, a temple that was probably built by Solomon. It has the two pillars that we talked about yesterday. So before Luxor was Karnak. Karnak was a little bit further south, just like a few, like a half mile or something. I'm not sure if it was a mile or two, but not very. I think it was just right there, Karnak. And Karnak was on this mound. And so it was a very sacred place, and there they worshipped Amun. Now, all the temples around there were dedicated to Amun and Hathor and Ra, Amun-Ra, or what have you, Aten, and so forth. However, it was very prominent, this Amun. And this is why this original city was called Thebes there, right in that same area, was later called Mene, which is the word Amun. It's just the same word, but a Greek way of spelling it. So the city of Amun, then later on today we call it Memphis. And so Memphis is another big famous city down in Egypt. Memphis or Men or Amun is originally this area there at Karnak, which would have been the city of David on the mound, Mount Moriah. Now this Moriah, we're not sure where it was. Herodotus lived around 450 BC, and he wrote history very accurately. Wasn't an idiot, right? And he said there was a place called a lake Mora. And he said the lake was vast, and beneath the lake was a pyramid that stuck out of the top part of the pyramid stuck up out of the water. And he said that I don't know if the pyramid was 600 feet above the water or 600 feet from the top to the bottom. But either way, that is quite a bit larger than the pyramid at Giza. It would then therefore be the largest pyramid of all of them. And it's not that far where they believe there might have been a lake called Moeris, but it's about 50 miles southwest of present Giza. Now, there is stories that there was originally 4 great pyramids. We have the 3 great pyramids there today, but some will say that the 4th pyramid was leveled to create Cairo. However, whatever this other pyramid was, it was certainly great. It was, at least according to Herodotus, and you have to think that Herodotus, being a historian, talked to the local priests, viewed it. He said he saw it himself rising up out of this sea, More. And, all of this mound talk is where different temples were acting out the great mound of Ararat, or where Noah landed the boat. Ararat is the word in Hebrew meaning earth. The Egyptians called it their mound or their mountain. Mountain. It's the same word. And In ancient Africa, there's a big mountain even further south called Meru, which is where much of this may have originally got started. But again, it wasn't the original Moriah, Mur. But because of this mountain and these holy places, the Egyptians had in their language a word that was just MR. And it can be, if you add the vowels different ways, it could be Mora or Mount Moriah that David, built the city of David. Zion is what we call it, but of course it's just a replica or a reenactment of the actual Zion, which is, I believe, the whole earth, the mound of the entire earth. The geographical center of all the land masses of the world is there at the Pyramid of Giza. And that, of course, is the one with the empty tomb of Osiris. So I believe that is the Great Pyramid. What this other one was, I'm not sure, but Herodotus said it was there, and underneath of it was a great labyrinth. Now, the labyrinth, as he called it, would be very similar to what we talk about with the halls of Amenti. Now, remember, Ammon is what that word Amenti is, and with the T on the end, it's a feminine, but it's Ammon, and Ammon is one of these. I mean, you have all these deities, sometimes you don't know which one's which or who's the greatest. You got Ra, you got Aten. Well, Ra is the spirit, and Aten is the earth. And together they make the Amun-Ra. And so Amun is something that is really the word man, like the son of man or the man. It probably could refer to Adam or to Jesus. But the thing about this is they understood all these things that we talk about using their own esoteric language, which has somehow translated into what we have here in the Bible. This mound where the city of On is where the Noah landed in the middle of this mass called Erat or earth, and they built this temple, and it rose up out of the mire. So beyond, we don't know the exact details of history other than what the Bible says. And it certainly fits quite well with the story and the things that we've got going on there down in Egypt. However, this word Gihon in the Septuagint Bible, which is the inspired Bible, the Sanhedrin there at the temple at Alexandria were priests of Heliopolis. They translated the word Gihon that went around or through the land of Cush, probably all the way to the land of Cush, down from the Mediterranean to the land of Cush, is a river that flowed out of Eden, and the Septuagint calls it the Nile. So there, the spring of Gihon, where David had Solomon go and be anointed king with this holy water, is more likely the little sacred lake at Karnak that they diverted the Nile or the Gihon. They diverted a flow of the river Nile or Gihon, and they made this sacred pool, the pool of Siloam. And this is a very sacred pool that the Bible talks about, and I believe it's there at Karnak. It's also where Jesus healed the blind man. So, since there's no other river but the Gihon, which the Septuagint and everyone says is the Nile, except for this little Gihon spring, which the word spring is not in the Bible. It's just the flowing of the Gihon, and it means a river. The Gihon River is the Nile. That's where Jesus was baptizing. And there you see it in our Bible as the pool of Siloam, which is off of the flowing river of the Nile. Now, of course, then from there, Moses comes along, Ra, Moses, this is a pharaoh. Manetho, a Egyptian historian, says that Moses was a pharaoh. So the historical records do know who Moses was, and he was a pharaoh. And he led the children of Israel out of Egypt. Why? If that's their homeland? Because there's always got to be the bad guy come along and drive you out. And then why are you being driven out? Well, it's like being driven out of heaven into the earth, and it's not good, but you're learning something. So we went from this original homeland, right, to the great city, and we were driven out, and they went around in a wilderness, or what? That word is desert, and it comes from the Egyptian word desert, and it meant the red soil, as opposed to the fertile black soil. It was coming down from Lake Victoria in the mountainous region of Africa, down the Nile, and it would bring it up and it would deposit this black soil, this good, rich soil, the best soil in all the world, along the Nile, the banks. And along the Nile was all this fertility. So they liked the black soil, and the black soil was called Kemet, the black soil. But the red soil was the desert, and it represented an inferior place, the wilderness. You wanted to be by the black soil there in the order, right? In the area where the priests were, and they were acting out the initiation unto life. And they had houses and places of comfort and food. It was paradise. So Israel was sent into the desert, or the red soil, and they went to the wheel of Gilgal, where they put 12 stones when they crossed the Nile. I know the Bible says Jordan, but the word Jordan, again, just means a flowing, gushing river. Exactly the same as Gihon, which is translated Nile by the Septuagint. They set up the 12 stones, which mean 12 temples, not rocks. Yeah. And those 12 temples are significant esoteric places that, as above, so below, correspond to places in your body and places in the universe, or the cosmology of the universe, and the plan of salvation. So that word Gilgal is elsewhere, as you go down, called, with a different syntax, Gal Ali, because now you've got some syntax with it. The word Gal means a wheel, and it's talking about the wheel of rebirth. And it's also talking about a circuit. And so it uses it in the sense of the circuit of the nations, where all the tribes went. And each of the tribes got their lot, right? The promised land wasn't Palestine or Philistia. It was the lot that they got around the circumference of the hub there at Heliopolis. So they went and they became the nations. Well, the Jewish people, the southern tribe, which would correspond to Cush, black people, they originally got taken to Babylon, but then they came back. However, there's a group of them that thought they were, escaping Babylon, and perhaps they weren't even Jewish, right? Because more than likely the true Jews are black. But they claimed to be Jewish, and they built a Jerusalem, but it wasn't in Egypt. They went up there in Esau's territory. And I don't even think they were really Jews. Jesus went there and said, "What are you people? You brood of vipers? Who are you? What are you, hypocrites?" Yeah, something like that. Huh. And they went back to a place called Palestine to build their temple. Why would they do that? I don't know. But other Israeli people, people from Israel, went back to the Nile and rebuilt Jerusalem. This was a new Jerusalem all along the aisle when they rebuilt all those temples. Down in the Elephantine south and in the northern area up around Heliopolis and Leontopolis. There were these temples that Israelites built. And that's where the Zadokite priesthood was. We know that from Josephus. We know that from all of history. And the last reigning Zadokite priest in that area there at Heliopolis, which the New Testament calls on the road to Emmaus, which is the road to Heliopolis, where their eyes were opened, where John the Baptist, beyond the Jordan or on the other side of the Nile, was building this place called Heliopolis. And there, the New Jerusalem, they were baptizing people. So John, the last of the Zadokite priests, there was one other after him that they say is Jason. But of course, that is the exact same word as Jesus. You can use different syntax, Jisun, Jesus, or Jisu. But Jisun is the same as the word Jesus. It has nothing to do with Joshua, guys. Let's get that out of your head. Yahshua has nothing to do with the name Jesus. It's an Egyptian name. And it's what Cleopatra called little Caesar or Caesarion when he was born, Isa. And the Arabic peoples call him Isa, the people in India call him Isa. And our Bible calls it Isu. That's it, Isu. Now the syntax is Isun, Isus. But this On had 4 descents. There was On 1, On 2, On 3, and On 4. And I think there might have been an On 5. But the last of the high priests there was a Jason or a Jesus. And this is the On, or with the syntax Onias, which is John, as we would say it, or Jonas, of our Bible. And so John was baptizing, and they had a temple there. Now, the other Jews at Herod's temple, which is a Edomian, Herodian, which is Arabian from Esau, was not the place where the original temples were in the Bible, where Solomon built his temple at Luxor, or David at Karnak, or any of the others. But all of these temples expressed this creation story, and they all talked about this Moriah, or mountain, or Meru, and the Egyptian Mr, which means a mountain, and they also use the Mr to refer to the Great Pyramid. So we can see that when Abraham went to this area, it says in the Bible, he went to the Nile, and he climbed the mountain. Well, there is no mountain on the Nile, not a real mountain, right? There's this plateau, the mound there at Karnak, and that's where they built a Great Pyramid. Now, Abraham got up on top of this Mr, which is also where we get the word Mary. Okay, so it's the high priestess of this mountain. And this Myrrh, that in Hebrew is Moriah, Mount Moriah, that David built the city on. And so that's where Karnak was built. And right there by Karnak is this place called Dendera and the Temple of Hathor. So that was already there. And this was the temple dedicated to the Virgin Mother, or Eve, Mother Eve, the Virgin Mother. And at that temple, there were all these priests. And so King David was born there. And in our Bible, they call it Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem means Beth, house of Cham, which is bread, the house of bread. If you look it up, you'll see that's the house of the Virgin. That's where the Virgin Mother is. And it's because it's the temple house, the temple of the Virgin Mother. And that is where all the people were born who were of royal descent. Back to this Osiris, which is where Jesus was born in King David. It's where Miriam went, and in the early days it was called Ephratah because it had to do with Ephraim. Ephraim is right there on the border. It's a border between the Jews and Ephraim, right? The Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And that city, Bethlehem, in the Bible says too little to be among the cities of Judah. Why? Because they didn't want it. So the people from Ephraim also came there and had a Levirate marriage. Boaz, the Jew, had a Levirate marriage with Elimelech, which was the Canaanite king, El of Molech, and Naomi. And this was the woman's seed through Tamar, the Canaanite, or Rahab, the Canaanite, all the way back to Naamah, the wife of Noah, the one that Ham married and created the people there. The people that were the divine mother that most of the world, the Gentiles, made their temples to, up at Artemis and different places all around the world. So this place at Dendera, our Bible calls Bethlehem, was the city of the king. And there were various temples around. And then there was Karnak, where David built the city. And there was the mound, and there was the lake. And all of this was going on. And the John, or On, was baptizing there at the temple that they made in the days of Christ. That was a New Jerusalem. Well, in the days of Jesus, there was a woman named Mary. Okay, again, her name is Mary. They were all named Mary. Her mother was Mary. Her sister was Mary. Everybody was Mary. And their cousin too, because that was the high priestess. So the Virgin Mother Mary, we know, was, according to the scriptures that the Catholic Church has, the infancy Gospels and the Apocrypha and other Gnostic writings, that we know that Mary was a virgin priestess in the temple. You could not have a virgin priestess in the temple at Herod's temple because they didn't even like women. They wouldn't let women into the temple. They couldn't even enter in there. There was no wing of the temple that was dedicated to some high priestess or a virgin mother. They didn't have Vestal virgins. All the Gentiles did, but not them. So we know which temple because Mary Magdala gives it away. It's Mary of the Tower, because Magdala means tower. And it's the exact word that they use, not just for any tower, but for the temple that was built at Heliopolis. It had a tower. It was called its specific particular word. It's the tower or the temple at Heliopolis. And so Mary Magdala is Mary, the priest. Mary, even today in Italian, means Lord, or it's a title of authority, a priest. So it is a high priest of the Tower of Heliopolis is where Mary was. So Mary then was married, and this is where marriage come from, the true marriage, not the ancient slavery of Exodus 21:7 that says, when a man sells his daughter to another man, and that's what their marriages were, and they weren't called marriages, but when a woman, and there isn't even no wife there, it's just a woman, sells her daughter to her owner, husband, that means an owner, the Baal, then she shall never go free. She will be a slave forever. That was how it was under the Jewish law. But not so with the Egyptians. They reigned equally with their husbands on the throne. And they had priesthoods. Now, this is described in the Bible too, because Moses and Aaron were men and they had a priesthood. It was an appendage. It was the Levitical. However, it got its authority from the high priesthood of Jethro, whose daughter was Miriam, also called Zipporah. So Miriam was Moses' wife, and she was the high priestess, and she carried on the lineage there at Ephratah, or Ephraim's city, that was on the border of Ephraim and Judah, called Bethlehem, or as we said, Dendera, the temple of Miriam, Mary, or Hathor, and other places it may have been called other things, like up in Ephesus, they built a temple just like it with a tower, and they called it the Temple of Artemis. So here's Mary, the high priestess, marries Jesus the king, and as David married Bathsheba, as Noah married Naamah, as Judah married Tamar, as Joshua married Rahab the harlot, it was a welding of the two nations. The southern and the northern kingdoms became one. And of all of Israel became one at that time when King David did that. So Jesus then married the high priestess at the temple of Heliopolis, Mary Magdalene. They had children, and of course, because Jesus was the rightful heir, he went through a temple ceremony where he overcame death, as all the pharaohs had done, mummified, rose the third day, which they called the halls of Amenti, and the whole thing that we talked about yesterday. After he rose from the dead, he met his wife at dawn, because the Ra'el, the rays of El, or the Mary from that high priesthood that anointed Jesus for his burial and also anointed him to become Messiah, she met him there. And this is another part of the entire Egyptian astrological story that's written in the sky that comes down from before the flood, from Enoch and the great priesthoods of Atlantis, pre-flood. So when Jesus raised from the dead, he completely and fully did not see corruption, as it says in Psalms chapter 22. His body did not decay, but he literally raised up his body. And as the Quran says, he didn't actually die, but he appeared to die. What he was doing was going through a ritual to use the Holy Spirit and a sacred herb that gave one the ability to ascend to the highest heaven and receive immortality, and therefore transform that physical body, the mortal body, into an immortal one, as the Apostle Paul described. When he awakened also his wife, Mary. And they went with their children. They ended up having children. They had a daughter named Sarah and a son named Joseph after their father. Because remember, in the Bible and in history, there is no actual names given for the people. We talked about Alexander, meaning the defender of the people, and Darius, meaning the upholder of truth. Well, Caesar just means one in the line of the Osiris. And that wasn't his name. In our Bible, he's called Lazarus or La Osiris. And he was the one that Jesus loved because that was his father. And then he had two sisters, Martha and Mary. And that's in the Egyptian, word for word. It's called Mary and Myrti. And the whole story's there in the Egyptian story. So Jesus took Mary and Martha and Lazarus, because he was raised from the dead, as Horus raised Osiris, and they went to Marseille, France. When they got to Marseille, France, Lazarus became the bishop of the newly founded kingdom because the 72 went with him on the boat. The 72. Now, the 12 probably went all around the world to start branches or colonizing or being ambassadors to that kingdom, to the other kingdoms of the world. So Thomas went to India, and Philip went to Africa, and Bartholomew went somewhere, and they all went to their different places. So, but Jesus and Mary went with the Sanhedrin, the 72, to Marseille. At that location, right around that area in Marseille, and then Montpellier, and later on in Narbonne, there was the capital. It was called Septimania at some point because that was the place of the 7 cities, and the 7 cities were 7 cities of gold. Now, the reason why there was so much gold is because Jesus and Mary Magdalene were the heirs of all the wealth of Persia, Syria, Egypt, Rome, and the then known world. All of the wealth. They probably had with them the Ark of the Covenant and everything else. Because remember, this is in Egypt anyway, and the Ark of the Covenant, according to the Ethiopian Bible, and that tradition is down that way. So they had all this wealth, and it was buried somewhere that the world would never find it, but they had that wealth. And then there's a lot of stories about how the Templars took that wealth to America and so forth. And we've done videos about how it may have actually ended up in this little place called Cibola County where I live. Very interesting and curious that all of these details seem to be just so amazing, but nevertheless, all of this is true, and you can look it up. So there was about 4 generations of father to son until we get to a man named Agulf. Agulf, in the Languedoc region, fathered a child named Saint Benedict. Now, there's 2 Saint Benedicts, and they're both Benedictine monks, and they're in the same lineage. So the first one is Benedict of Nursia, where we get the word nurse. And he started the Benedictine order. And then a couple of hundred years more, a descendant and goes into the monastery and does all of the stuff. And then when he's finished, he goes back to the Languedoc or the Septimania area in southern France and creates another monastery of the Benedictine order. Saint Benedict of Ainine. Ainine's father was Agulf. Agulf was the Count of Magulone. Okay. Magulone is a alternate spelling of Magdalene. Magulone. So he was the count, meaning that's the word today we have here in America, the county. So it was not the government itself, but it was a local government. And so in various kingdoms, they would have a king, and then they would have governors or counts that would rule certain counties. So he had a title. He was one of the rulers of this Languedoc area called Septimania, but he was the Count of Magdalene, and his name was Benedict. At that time, they weren't, this is back in 700 or something. And so there was already getting to be tension with the Roman Catholics, but this wasn't yet that time that we called the time of the Holy Roman Empire, where they really began to do all the inquisitions. So at this time, before Charlemagne, there was still some peace between the two. At this time, I remember until 300, the church was the church at the Languedoc. That was the Holy Church. It was the Cathars, or the what they would call the early church, that were very Gnostic and followed the mysteries, or the Coptic church of the Egyptian mysteries. Many of the early Christians were Coptic Christians, and many of the temples down there were still being used by Christians. And this is where we found the Nag Hammadi library, at the area down there at Luxor, in the area of Karnak and Memphis and the Temple of Hathor. So there at Luxor, they found these Christian gospels, but they were very, very esoteric, sort of the learning for the initiates. And this is why they were not with the Bible. They were not added to the Bible, because they were not for the vulgar, or for the ones just coming in and just newly being baptized. They were for those who were initiated into the deeper mysteries. So, before the Holy Roman Empire, there was some cooperation. The church wasn't fully opposed to the Gnostic Christianity. It wasn't even until Constantine, who came down and allowed these Germanic tribes that were trying to propose an Arian belief, where Jesus was not divine, and there was only one deity, and it was just this one man, a bearded man floating around, and Jesus was not fully divine. He was just the son of deity. He was just a man. Well, thank goodness that failed, Arianism, because at that time, all the bishops were mostly Gnostic. In fact, the Gnostic bishop there in Rome, that was pretty much the chief bishop there, was a Gnostic bishop. All of them were Gnostic at that time, people like Origen and so forth. So, Saint Benedict, from the lineal descent of the Knights of St. John, which is the Benedictine order, which then became the Knights of St. John, and then later the Hospitallers, and after that the Templars. And then right at the point where, here in America, around the time that they assassinated Joseph Smith, which is 1844, right after that they assassinated Lincoln. Both of these assassinations were done by the Knights of the Golden Circle, and James Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle killed Joseph Smith and Abraham Lincoln, as well as later on around 1880, they were still there trying to get rid of, there were still some of the good guys trying to come in, but Garfield was shot down, Mr. Garfield been shot down low. Yeah, this was assassinations that were going on because they were trying to get rid of the true esoteric believers from France, Benjamin Franklin being the grand master of these ancient esoteric truths that go back to Mary Magdalene and Jesus. He was the grand master of the French Lodge, and then the lodge that was made here in America. Out of that lodge came Abraham Jonas. Abraham Jonas was a master mason, a grand master, and he initiated Joseph Smith. And so all of this was part of the true priesthood back to Mary. But this Knights of the Golden Circle was from the Illuminati. That is when they infiltrated the Illuminati. 1776 was made in Bavaria, Germany, and in 1776 the good guys made the Constitution to allow human beings in these last days to have the option to choose what is right. So, the others, the bad guys, what they did, they couldn't change the Constitution. So what they did was they did propaganda, and they began to use banks and corruption and luring and immorality and debauchery to destroy the human race until we ourselves began to just kill each other. However, the Constitution still stands until the day that Christ returns. Everyone has the choice to be a free citizen and to keep their freedom in Christ. You have to follow the truth and your liberty and your freedom. So that's when that whole thing was disbanded, and now we have what we have, the apostasy, after the death of Joseph Smith in 1844 and Abraham Lincoln. As I've said, the Continental Constitution, before the Constitution of the colonies, the original government was brought over here from France. They had a French-style government from Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. There was the founding fathers who had places like Montpelier and Monticello and Mount Vernon, which were places that harkens back to the Roman-style architecture. The Gothic style that started happening right after that was because of the takeover of the people from York and the New York, and that's where Brigham Young came from, around New York, and he was part of a group called the Cochranites, and they were polygamists. He was sent in then by the York Rite and by Albert Pike, who took over and infiltrated with his people that were coming over from the York Rite, infiltrated the Scottish Rite, and they murdered people and presidents and Joseph Smith, and they changed the ancient esoteric rites from 3 degrees to 33. And this is because they intended to make a worldwide psyop and have everyone on the earth become initiated in some degree under the umbrella of the great Illuminati that now infiltrated the New Jerusalem, or the original Templars building the temple of the New Jerusalem worldwide as the kingdom of deity on earth. So the Illuminati took over, and Albert Pike wrote the Morals and Dogma and sent Brigham Young in to shoot and kill Joseph Smith. He didn't personally kill him, but he had people to do it, and then took over the group, and they went to Salt Lake and built a Gothic temple there. And they became the Western branch of the Illuminati in this country and control all the government of the western part of the United States. Nevada, most of California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, all this area is controlled by the western branch of the Illuminati called the Mormons by Brigham Young. So at that point, the Knights of the Golden Circle basically took over. They disbanded the name because they didn't want you to think that they won or anything, but they did. And they infiltrated the government by assassinating certain individuals and then inserting or infiltrating those organizations. So all Masons today are infiltrated, whether it be Mormons or Masons of any kind. They made the Jehovah's Witnesses another branch of the Masons, the Moonies over in another part of the world, and all Advents, and everybody, Ellen White's got an obelisk, right, on her grave. Charles Russell's got a big pyramid, and all of them have these symbolisms. Some of them are from, like Joseph Smith, he has an obelisk on his grave, but then his goes back to like Washington, the true teachings, the esoteric teachings. But some of them are just imposters. What happens is, as we showed yesterday, in order to become a true Master Mason, you have to follow the steps of hope and faith and charity, and you have to learn and become wise, and you have to be humble. And until you can pass these, you go and you present yourself at the end of this course to the worshipful master to see if you're going to get your diploma. And he's supposed to look at you and see if you accomplished the things that you were supposed to accomplish, like baptism, like not being an alcoholic or a drunk, having not been a pedophile or something. You couldn't become an initiate had you been a pedophile in the true esoteric wisdom from the Knights of St. John. So what they did, an example of this is Aleister Crowley. He tried to go and get the mysteries from the Rosicrucian order, the original Rosicrucians, but they rejected him. Well, why? How? They don't usually reject people right out of hand. He must have been a pretty crude and an immoral person. So for Aleister Crowley, rather than saying, "Oh, I will repent and stop being an alcoholic and a rebel rouser and an abuser of women and a molester of children, and I'll repent in sackcloth and I want the true mysteries," he couldn't do that. He wouldn't do that. So he could not get the higher mysteries from the esoteric believers. So he went to the other priesthood, the Judeans, and they offered him their knowledge, which is the same knowledge, but all upside down and backwards. It was kind of like in the movie of Star Wars, where you've got Obi-Wan Kenobi's apprentice, whose name was Anakin. Interesting, that's kind of like the Anunnaki, right? Well, Anakin was an apprentice under Obi-Wan Kenobi, going back to... Now, in this story, it's all messed up because you've got this Yoda, which is some Jewish... He represents some magic Jewish occult group. So there's a lot of backwards and misinformation in Star Wars. But if you look at Anakin's son, Luke, which is Lucifer, you understand where they're going with that. But in the story, Anakin wanted to kill the people who murdered his mother. He wanted vengeance. He wanted anger. He wanted to make the world a better place. His heart was right, huh? So he wanted to conquer the empire and get rid of the bad people and do it by force and force everybody to be good. That's, the law of Moses and control and slavery. Well, Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "Don't do it. Don't do it, Anakin. Right? Please don't do it. I don't want to kill you." So he, whops off his leg and he falls in the burning fires of hell. And everything burned up except for his chest and his head. And the bad guys came along in their ship and swooped him up and said, "We'll give you what you seek. You can get rid of the bad guys. You could kill them all." But, and they built him a suit where he's like, he's in this, because he's just got a heart and a brain. It was all burned up. He became Darth Vader. And so it's kind of like the Antichrist. He's gone wrong, right? So they became the priesthood of the dark force. And Obi-Wan Kenobi was supposedly the good force. Now, there may be a little bit of mixing and matching there because, Hollywood is run by Spielberg and they're probably trying to favor their priesthood rather than... So they're trying to make themselves look like the good guy or whatever. It's all backwards and forwards like they always do. Turning up the Great Pyramid, turning it upside down or the cross and doing these signs and flashing them, claiming to be of this esoteric priesthood, but not understanding it. Because people like Aleister Crowley never did learn. They learned bits and pieces from what the Judeans know. The dark side. Many of the good people have already been murdered and killed and infiltrated. And they systematically, with all their wealth and banking, financing, built these false religions and the great apostasy and infiltrated the true priesthood. And the Masons we have today are all evil and are just a department of Zionism, vengeance and hate. And it's a plot to kill the Goyim and all the rest of the world. I guarantee it. So, bye-bye to the true priesthood. However, the true priesthood, the true esoteric wisdom, they were not godless. They believed in Jesus, and they believed in Mary, and they believed in John the Baptist, and the ancient esoteric mysteries. They traced their order back to France, back to the Languedoc, back to the Benedictine order, which goes back to Mary Magdalene, back to the Languedoc. So yes, Benedict went to serve in the court under King Pepin and learned a lot of things, and he was put over this whole order of the priests. And yes, he was very Gnostic. He came from the Languedoc, the Cathars. It's a whole different Christianity than what we understand and know today. Benedict became the order of the Benedictine priests, the order of this monasticism. They were, many of them celibate. They were pure. They were nothing like Aleister Crowley, indulging in all kinds of evil. They went through the rites and initiation that had been handed down from the temple at Heliopolis. And when he was done pursuing his monasticism, he returned. He hadn't forgotten his family in the Languedoc region, and he inherited the land near Ainine, or I should say the Ainine River, and that's where he established the first monastery, or the Benedictine monasteries, is there in the Languedoc with his people, the children of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. But it's interesting that the land that he inherited was by this river, Ainine. So he was called Saint Benedict of Ainine. Now, Ainine, nobody knows where that word came from or why that river was called that. But his family was called that, just like they had done for centuries. They would have titles like, I'm this guy from this place. So, for instance, later on, that priesthood of this order from Mary Magdalene that eventually became the Knights of St. John and the Hospitallers and down the line. But they were then just called the Waldensians. Waldensians is the word people of the valley. So you could be from a certain place, and that would end up being your last name. He was Peter of the Valley. And this here is Benedict of the Ainine. The Ainine was a very well-known river. And in those days, they understood what this river was. Remember, this was the Languedoc area, originally was Gaul. And when the people came down there originally and colonized that area, they were Iberians. Iberians are people from the Hebrews, the Hebrew Iberians. They were brothers with the Celts, and the Celts colonized Gaul. The Celts were people who had their lineage back to Israel. They knew that, and so when Jesus Christ went there, he set up the Sanhedrin there, the 72, and that became the capital of the world in a sense, even though today we don't know about it. It was sort of a competition for what later arose over at a different place in Italy called the Holy Roman Empire, and then later up in the Byzantine. But this was one of the major areas where there was this Sanhedrin. And so this is where we get a lot of the writings from that point forward, libraries, we get the Kabbalah, and there were temples. People like at Alexandria would read. There was a priesthood. The Cathar priests, they sat with Islam. Later on, as time went on, Islam came along after 600. And at that time, these were true Christians. They were just sort of divisions of these ancient mysteries. There was Islam, there were Christians, and there was the Sephardic Jews, which were actually Christians from Mary Magdalene. That's how they got in there. There may have been some type or form of ancient Judaism, of the ancient religion of Israel there with the people that had originally come with the Iberians. But they were all brothers, and they would sit at a table together in peace and study the ancient wisdom. They studied astrology and wrote the Kabbalah and ancient works like the Sefer Yetzirah and the Zohar and other very important works of history. But why did they call that area the Ainine? Well, remember, Rome was started by a man named Annius. So this Saint Benedict of the Anine is in the Languedoc in France. That was around 750. He's the one who founded a monastery on his family's estate in the Languedoc. That's in France, next to the Anine River. Now, he was following in the footsteps of another Saint Benedict, but this was Saint Benedict of Nursia, who was back in the year 500 AD, 400 and something AD. He was like a hermit. He lived in a cave. And he lived also on the Anine River. But this is a different river. This is the Anine River in Italy, not in France. The river in France was named after the river, or the order, the monastery, the Benedictine monks were in a tradition going back to Italy from the Anine River. The Anine River was originally the Anio River, and that is where Aeneas, an individual who established Rome, the individual from the royal bloodline of Romulus, who killed his brother Remus. They were brothers who were born from a divine being. Because Romulus and Remus were twin brothers. You know, this is always the case in these mythologies, is what it is. It's a mythology. It doesn't mean it's not true. It means it's consolidating a long historical story in a parable. So these twin brothers, Remus and Romulus, were sons of the god Mars, right? Mars. And a Vestal virgin named Ray, like the ray of the light of sun. You see, these are titles. Ray Silvia. Well, so he's a divine ancestor of Mars, which goes back to Zeus and all the gods. So the great uncle of Romulus usurped a throne, and he was afraid that he was going to be overthrown. Remus and Romulus's uncle thought they would overthrow his throne because they had this royal bloodline. So their great uncle threw them into the river, the Tiber River. Then there was a servant who saw them floating in the river in a basket. He saved them and nursed them. They were nursed by a she-wolf. Okay, this might be where, on the river Aeneas, where he went, the Anio River, his name was Aeneas of Nursia. And this is probably where we get the word nurse, because all these words go back to these divine beings and these cosmic powers. And so the hospitallers came from this, as you will see, and they had nurses. So then we go down the line, and they grow up. They restore their grandfather's throne. They build their own city on this place called Palatine Hill. Remus built another place on Aventine Hill. So then they had a quarrel, and Romulus killed his brother out of a fit of rage. Very similar to, Cain killing Abel. This was like 750 BC. So then we go down to Aeneas, who is a Trojan prince, a Greek prince. He is the son of this goddess Venus, or in Greek they would call him Aphrodite, which means Isis, which means Eve. And so the Greeks destroyed the city of Troy in the Trojan War. So Aeneas flees, and he goes to Italy. When he gets to Italy, by the will of the gods, he founds a new kingdom. Well, this is written about in the works of Virgil, and it's called the Aeneid. So he arrives in Italy. He marries a local princess named Lavinia. He makes a new city called Lavinium. And then this is the Trojan lineage in Italy. He makes an alliance with the people of the Latins. That's very important, the Latins, because later on the Latins became the royal bloodline through the line of Aeneas, back on down through Venus and Mars. Venus and Mars. They get, the men are Mars and women are Venus. This goes all the way back to the Great Marriage. As we go down, then, the Roman Empire was founded by this Holy Roman bloodline called the Latins. And Latino is the family line that ends up going to Malta or Sicily, and they end up covering the world. They're the Roman peoples. Today we call the Latin Americans, or Latin is a language that people speak, right? It's most of the Europe and America. Well, it goes back to these Latins or the Romans. And one line went to the Languedoc through Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and then down to this Benedict of Nursia, who founded the Benedictine order, and then Benedict of Anine, who is of the same descent, the Anian River, because the original Benedict made a monastery, and the Benedictine monks started there on the Anine River in Italy. Well, another ancestor in the tradition of this same monastery, another Benedict, makes a Benedictine monastery in a place in the Languedoc, calling that river the Anine River. It certainly is related, and it goes straight back to the lineage of the gods, or the lineage of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, and eventually ends up on the Isles of Malta, which is where the Knights of St. John were removed to and became the Hospitallers and the Templars and the Knights of St. John. But that is just another one of these particularly important bloodlines, this Latino, that carries the blood of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. But guys, I am way over an hour, and maybe this is an odd place to stop, but I think we're going to have to stop it here. It's actually dark here. I got to get this loaded. But we'll do and talk more about all of this. And as you know, the Lord loves everybody. And all that you've heard about how the Lord is vengeful and hateful and wants to throw everybody in hell, it's all false. And all he wants you to do is come unto him with open arms. I'm going to go ahead and go. You guys have a great evening. His grace and his peace will always be with you. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.